Hi, I'm Sean Bonner, and yeah, I'm the co-founder of Safecast, and also with KO University and MIT Media Lab, and can be found online at Sean Bonner, kind of everywhere. I've actually been to spoken at Republica about 10 years ago, and at that point I talked about citizen journalism, and they asked me to come back and this year to talk about citizen science and sort of the connection between those things. And immediately, obviously, the citizens are the piece that starts to connect them. But you know, for me, honestly, citizen's a really loaded word, and I don't like to use it much because people can argue about what is or isn't a citizen. And so when I think of all of these projects, I like to think more about a community and what the community wants to do and how that ends up happening. And so in trying to think about how I tell that story to you guys, I kind of thought maybe I would just tell a little bit of my own story and different communities that I've been involved with, and how one sort of led into the other, and the lessons that I learned from one and how that ended up applying. And so I figured I should just go ahead and start all the way back at the beginning. So I was born in Washington, D.C., in the capital of the United States, but I didn't live there very long. When I was very young, we moved to this tiny little middle of nowhere town in Florida. And this is my first driver's license to prove that. But as a kid, like kind of growing up in the middle of nowhere, my outlook on the world was not especially positive. And here's a picture of me from high school in a television production class. And you can see I don't really fit in with all the other people that were there. They're all kind of like smiley, happy, and I'm this like weird kid in the middle, and I like different music than they did, and I just didn't really get along. But this is sort of an important picture because this guy over here, his name's Tom Garland, and he was the first person ever to show me a BBS. And I didn't know like the sort of age of the audience. I'm talking about dial-up bulletin boards, right? But for me at this point, this was really mind-blowing because my world had basically consisted of people who were in the same room with me, and I didn't necessarily have any choice on that. But all of a sudden, through BBS, I could find other people who were sort of into the stuff I was into, and I could maybe leave them a message, and maybe they would get back to me. And I realized that people have this strong need to find their people, and they want to like connect with them somehow, and that sort of stuck with me all along. And so again, I was really into this sort of like punk rock, like do-it-yourself music scene at the time, and I put out a record of like some of my friends' bands, and the thing that really got me excited about all of this at the time was like punk rock was kind of like fiercely independent. Like we were just like doing our own thing, but everybody who was involved with it was doing something, right? Somebody had a fanzine, somebody had a band, somebody had a record label, and we were all kind of pulling it together to create something. And once you get the idea that you can sort of make this thing and you don't need outside people to do it for you, that's a really hard lesson to unlearn. And it sort of stuck with me through all the rest of the stuff. So a few years later, this is another picture of me in my friend's apartment, and this is another cool picture, not because my shoe apparently was falling apart, and I guess I duct taped it back together. But in this room was the first person that I ever knew who had IRC. And so with BBSs, I could leave messages, but with IRC, I could talk to them. Like I could actually have real conversations, and we could, immediately find these connections. And so I kept putting out records, and lots of different bands and all this stuff over the years. And IRC was absolutely instrumental in that happening at all, largely because of this channel called Punk. And that's not a hashtag, it was a channel, just pre-hashtag. And on this channel, I could find people in other cities and say, I have this band, like what's a store in your town that might want to sell this record, or is there a venue that this band could play, or if we were on tour, like traveling through, like is there somebody's house that we could crash at or something. And I'm still really good friends with a lot of the people that I met during those days and through that time. And the lesson that I took out of that was that we can actually build our own communities. And again, as a kind of kid growing up in this, like this really was huge to me, and kind of made me very idealistic, and think that with enough sort of gusto on this, maybe we could actually change the world. And so elsewhere online at the same time, I was into these like kind of weird Japanese toys, and I found this other guy named Matt Alt who was into these things, and we started making a website to try to document some of this stuff. And so we were just writing about these toys, and this really cool thing happened in that some other toy websites started to talk about the stuff that we were doing. And I realized that if you start talking about the things that you care about in public, then you attract the other people who care about them as well. And so there's this idea of, you're finding your communities or you're creating your communities, and those things start jamming together, and it creates this even bigger thing. And for me, the next logical step on that was blogs, and we started having blogs. And so the first blog that I was ever involved with was, again, in these kind of Japanese toy world, and we were writing about these weird 1970s kind of toys, and there was immediately a conflict that kind of popped up in that a lot of people who were reading it were like, oh, how come you're not talking about these other toys? And you're like, well, I'm not into those toys, right? So we had this idea that if we created like a community on the site where anybody could go in and talk about their own thing, then people would have a place to talk about the thing, and I could talk about the thing I cared about, they could talk about the thing that they cared about, and this worked out really well, like amazingly well. And so rather than fighting over what we were going to write about on the site, everybody got to write about their own thing, whatever they wanted to. And I kept that idea in mind a few years later when I moved to Los Angeles. And local media at that time was really bad. Everybody was kind of chasing big national stories, and there wasn't a lot you could gather from local news if you wanted to find out what was happening in your town or something. And I realized that I was spending a lot of time reading local blogs and seeing what bloggers in Los Angeles were talking about. And my friend Jason DeFilippo and I had this idea that if we got all these people and had them write for just one site all of their Los Angeles stuff, it might be a cool resource. And 2004, like there wasn't really an idea of a group blog at the time. This was sort of a weird thing that more than one person would write a blog together. But it worked out really well, and it became this really kind of powerful thing for people in LA. And pretty quickly, we started getting all these contacts from people in other cities that said, I love that thing you're doing in Los Angeles. Like, can we do it in my city too? And so we created this thing called metroblogging, where all these different people in different cities could write about the stuff happening in their city, and they could sort of become their like local authority on it. And that's actually why I was at Republica 10 years ago, was sort of talking about local blogs as citizen journalism. And I looked all over to try to find my talk from them. I can't find it any place. But luckily, somebody blogged about my talk, and they gave me all the cliff notes of the stuff that I talked about, which was pretty cool to find. But I kind of covered the bases on a lot of these like really big stories that were either first written, maybe sometimes hours, sometimes days on local blogs before national or international media really picked up and started doing it. And even once they did, the local bloggers were telling it in a very different way, right? I mean, if you imagine someone in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina was hitting, talking about what's happening with their neighbors and in their neighborhood and how they're preparing and how they're surviving and everything. This is a very different story than someone who kind of shows up and stands in the street with a microphone and a camera and tells you how much the wind's blowing, right? So the stories are more authentic, but also for the people in the cities, it was very powerful for them to be able to tell their own story, and they could help decide how they were being represented in public. But most importantly was they didn't have to sit around and wait for somebody else to tell their story anymore. They could do it on their own. And this really kind of changed the mindset of these folks in a lot of interesting ways. So I was still hanging out on IRC a lot at the time, and I was hanging out on this channel called Joey Ito, which was created by this guy named Joey Ito, who I became good friends with, and we were playing World of Warcraft at the time. And so it was a fun game that we were playing, but there was also these really interesting social dynamics going on in the game. There was like this kind of chat thing over here, and there was like these guilds and all this like management of these other players and everything. And it was a really fascinating sort of virtual community that was happening. And sort of as community nerds, this was a really exciting thing for us. So we started to go to Warcraft conferences. That's Joey over there. And Joey started blogging about Warcraft, and then people started blogging about Joey blogging about Warcraft, and then pretty soon he was like giving these big talks at like big like web conferences. And I was thinking about that I have this network of blogs where people are talking about their cities, and then I'm a part of this like virtual community, and maybe there's a way to create a local blog about a virtual space. And so we created a blog for one of the fake cities inside Warcraft, and people were writing about it. And it was a kind of interesting experiment. But the truth is, like, advertisers really didn't get what we were trying to do at the time. And we had all these situations where like an advertiser would say, I love this blog on this city that you have where there's 500 or like 5 million people. Sorry, 500,000 people that live in the city. What can we do to get the page views up to to 5 million or something? Or it's like nothing, because there's not that many people that live in the city, and you're sort of missing what we're trying to do. And having the community that you're trying to build and create dependent on an advertiser or something that doesn't get it was really disheartening in a lot of ways. And so I kind of ran away from the blog thing for a little while, and I started trying to find something more physical. And I started spending a lot of time in hackerspaces, especially during Republica again. I was hanging out over here in Berlin at Seabase, and then I went to MELTDOWN over in Vienna for a while, and then I was at CCC in Cologne. And hackerspaces were really kind of hitting all of these things that I was really interested in, all these other things, right? They were like these independent spaces, but they were connected to each other in these other ways, right? And people there were doing stuff, and they were learning things that they could take and apply in other parts of their life, and it was a very powerful thing. For me, I just loved it. I couldn't get enough about it. And so I went back to Los Angeles, and I helped create Crashbase, which was the first hackerspace in LA. And it took off right away, and I got busy with other things. I wasn't able to stay as deeply involved as I wanted to, but it works, and it keeps working, and there's still tons of members, and there's still all of these things happening there. And the fact that it kept working even after I walked away was really important for me to see, because what I realized was that, if you get something in motion, people will kind of just run with it sometimes. They won't just kind of sit around and wait for it to fall apart. And so about the same time, I went to Japan for the first time. And this is a picture of me on the train right after I just got off the airplane. And I'm kind of jet-lagged. I know what's going on. And this is a picture of Joey taking a picture of me on the train. And this is some guy who I wasn't very impressed by the whole thing. I don't know who he was. But once I got to Japan, I realized I needed to find my people and the people who were into the stuff that I was into, because it was kind of a weird shift from where I was at before. And so I started hanging out in record shops, and of course in Tokyo Hackerspace, right? So I was hanging out with these hacker kids, and then I started to try to create some events and pull some of these people together who were involved in these different things. So this is an event that I did in Tokyo, and you can see there's like me and Joey and then Akiba from Tokyo Hackerspace, and so pulling these people together into the room. And then here's another event from Singapore a little while later, right? And again, it's like people from hackerspaces and like artists and like musicians and like kind of designers and creative people that I knew from all these other things, pulling them together into into one room and seeing what can happen with it. And then March 2011, in Fukushima, this earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, like triple thing happened. And everybody was very confused. We didn't know what was going on. And I had these connections to Tokyo, so I was reaching out to try to find out what was going on. Other people were scrambling around, and nobody really knew what was happening. And the little bit of information that was starting to come out really made no sense. People would see, a map like this would be published, and they're like, what does this even mean? I don't even know. Nobody knew. And so I started talking to Joey again, and Joey introduced me to his friend Peter, who lived in Tokyo and had lived in Tokyo for like 35 years and had family who was in one of the areas that got really severely impacted by the tsunami. And so we just started talking about, how can we get some information together? Because, there's no information available for people. Nobody knows what's happening. And so we thought, okay, let's reach out to everybody we know. We got to find somebody who knows something about this, different pieces, and we can pull them together and continue this conversation somehow. So we all reached out to whoever we might know that might have some connection. And so for me, that looked like my hacker friends at the Crashbase in Los Angeles and at Tokyo Hackerspace, my friend Matt Alt, who I had done the toy website with, who's now living in Tokyo, and he helped translate a lot of the Japanese stuff that was coming out from the official news sources on stuff. Bunny, who I knew from hacker conferences and who jumped in and started helping us build hardware. Hyan, who was a designer that I knew from IDEO, and she was creating visualizations with the data we were putting together. And Paul, who I knew from the Metro blog in Dublin, who jumped in and started helping us write the back-end software to manage it all. And Joey and Peter had the same sort of thing. They found all these people and pulled them together. And so we all got together and created this thing that ended up being this organization called Safecast. And at first, we just duct taped some Geiger counters to car windows and started driving around and trying to get an idea of what was happening, and realized that those measurements were changing much faster, and it was a little bit of a different story than kind of these big averages that were being published by anything official. So we created a hardware and software platform, and these little devices that had GPS on them and Geiger counters, and they take readings every 5 minutes or every 5 seconds, and then upload it into this giant data set, right? And you could attach them to cars or bikes or anything, and we could take them around. And so we started putting these maps together, and these circles are the evacuation zones, right? So we started seeing this story where inside of the evacuation zones, maybe the levels weren't necessarily that bad, but outside of the evacuation zones, they were much worse. And this was kind of conflicting, because there was most certainly situations where people had been moved from areas with low radiation into areas with high radiation, and we didn't quite get what was going on. So 7 years on, this is what our data looks like in that area. We really mapped out every street and created this absolutely perfect picture of what's happening. But an important piece of this is that we're not going and measuring. Rather, we created the tools and the platform so that the people there can measure on their own, right? So these areas are being measured by the people who live there and are impacted by it. And this really gave them a chance to have a say in what was going on with it, right? They got to measure stuff. They weren't getting answers from other places. But it also had some very interesting real-world impacts in that it forced the officials to do something. They actually changed the evacuation zones after we published this data showing that these things were different, right? And we expanded this out, and this is the data we have for Japan. It's basically every single street in Japan we've measured time and time and time again. But it turns out that the data that wasn't available in Japan also wasn't available anywhere else in the world. Nobody had this kind of stuff. So we started reaching out to other people, and people in other places started measuring. So this is what we have in Europe, and this is what we have in the US. And you can see these are, somebody attached a sensor to a car and went on a drive down a road, right? This is what we have around the world. And obviously there's some major holes that we still need to help fill in, but it's getting there, and it's already the largest data set that's ever existed of its kind in any way. Almost 100 million data points, and we put all of the data into the public domain. And it's actually growing faster, all the time. It's not slowing down in any way. So if you remember, I said that maybe some people will kind of participate once something gets going. I learned through this that sometimes some is all you need. You don't need everybody to do it. You just need some people who are going to be active with it, right? And with Safecast, I tried to build in these things that I noticed in all of these other things, right? Where the people are independent on their own. We gave them the tools, we gave them the best practices, but they're doing the thing on their own without any, hindrance or control from outside on this. There's lots of different ways for people to help with the project. Some people are making visualizations, some people are collecting data, some people are building devices. All of these different things people can do with it, right? And then again, it removes the reliance on some outside authority for the people in the areas that are measuring it. But it's not just about disaster and stuff, right? So this is Peter, who I mentioned before. And a few years ago, we went to Washington, D.C. to put on a workshop about Safecast and what we're doing with this. And so if you wanted to see the publicly available radiation data for Washington, D.C., the day before our event, it would have looked like this. There was absolutely nothing available. So we had this 2-day event where people came in and they built their own sensors, found out how they worked, understood it, got their sensors up and running, and then we sent them out, walk around Washington, D.C. and just measure stuff, and then come back and we'll put everything together. And so this was the data that was available just after 1 day of people walking around. We mapped out the whole city and found some interesting stuff. There's the World War II memorial over here that is built with very radioactive granite, and all of these kind of things that you might not have known otherwise. And that was really cool for people. But a much more interesting thing happened shortly thereafter, in that the US government released their data set of radiation in Washington, D.C., right? So they had this data, but since they were the only people that had the data, they kept it secret. And then as soon as there was another comprehensive data set available, there was no reason for them to keep it secret anymore, and so they released it. And so it's this kind of thing where releasing this open data actually creates even more public data than we had our hands in at all, which is where people start throwing around these kind of words like revolution, which is cool. But the result of that is that this does in fact change the world in all of these ways. And so I've been talking a lot about radiation. But last year, we actually started measuring air quality as well, because that's another thing that maybe if we're putting sensors around, it might be really useful to people. And so this is where we just put a bunch of them around Los Angeles last year. And on the system right now, you can see what's happening right now, or 5 minutes ago, or historical over the last week or the last month, and start seeing these trends, and where all this you start comparing the data from the different sensors and start kind of understanding what it is that people are breathing in the city. And so to tie this back into the sort of citizen science idea, right? I don't really like separating this out somehow, like somehow citizen science is different than real science or something. Because if it's valid science, it's valid science. It doesn't matter who's doing it as long as the results stand up. And so people getting involved with this is really powerful. And this is a tweet that just happened yesterday, and I thought it sort of fit, so I just stuck it in. But anyway, it doesn't really piece of the narrative, but it kind of makes sense. So for us with Safecast, trust is the big piece of this, right? Because we already know that people don't trust governments. People don't trust these big companies or organizations or whatever. But even independently, people don't necessarily trust each other, right? Like if there's some guy over here, he's going to say he measured something. I don't know who he is. Why should I believe any of that, right? But open data sort of changes that landscape, because if I have a device that I built myself and I know it works and I take readings on my street with it, and then somebody down the street has their own device and they take readings, and we measure the same area and we're able to compare those numbers and they line up, now I have a reason to believe what that person's saying, because I've tested against it. And then if 10 more people or 50 more people or 100 more people all measure the same area and we all start having the same numbers, then we know that we can trust each other, because the science backs up this going on and sort of creates this trust network out of this, right? And all of these people together create this community. The community creates these checks and balances against the official data, right? So if the official data and the data that the public is creating line up, then one validates the other, and back and forth. And this is super powerful. And it goes firmly against these kind of single sources and closed data, right? And it's all about lots of projects, open data, open standards that all come together and make this possible, which of course leads us to this Internet of Things stuff, right? Which, if we're honest, is a bunch of fake closed sensor networks that are really like 1 minute away from being bricks. And these things are all designed to fail, because they're proprietary and they're locked down, and people don't have access to their own data, and somebody can flip the switch someplace else and all of these devices just stop working. And the truth is that every dollar that's put into those companies is a waste, because 6 months now, a year from now or something, the company runs out of cash or gets acquired or pivots somehow, right? And everything stops working, the data goes away, and all the work that anybody's done just sort of disappears, right? And so we try to design against that with Safecast, by ensuring that the community is really the powerful piece of it. Everything's open, again, all the devices, everything. If all the people who kind of run Safecast disappear tomorrow, all the devices keep working. People can still keep measuring their own areas. They can still keep doing all of this stuff. The data still exists and is still super valuable. 10, 15, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, all that data is still valuable, because it's the most comprehensive data set that's ever existed. So regardless of our existence in any way, this is a valuable thing that gets created. So if we kind of loop back over this whole weirdly, I don't know if it flowed or not, story that I just told you, people want to find the people who are like them, and they want to build a community with them, right? And you can attract the people by talking about the things that you care about. And then once you get them, you can carve out your own place, right? And you don't have to get somebody else's permission to make that happen. You can just do it. And then other people will see that you're doing it, and they'll jump on and do it as well. And if you get a few people who are running with it, then you can actually change the world with it. Thanks. That's me.